So again, I'd like to welcome you to today's TechNet webcast. This is Planning for and Deploying Microsoft Office SharePoint Server 2007. Today's part one of our two-part series. It's my pleasure to introduce today's TechNet presenter. We have Kevin Remdy here with us, and Kevin is part of the Microsoft Across America team. So Kevin, I'm going to let you take it away.
All right, thanks very much, Janet. Well, greetings and welcome once again to today's webcast, Planning for and Deploying Microsoft Office SharePoint Server 2007. As Janet mentioned, this is part one of a two-part series. We're going to be recording part two on Wednesday of this week. So those of you that are listening to this live, please make sure you tune in again. As she said, my name is Kevin Remdy, and I'm an IT Pro Evangelist with Microsoft. Mark those down on the slide here. And I also like to point out my email address and my blog address. I want you to be able to use those as a resource should you have any additional questions after the webcast is over or after you've viewed the online on-demand webcast. I've also posted on my blog today a resource page for this session. And in fact, I'm going to give you that link that goes directly to that resource page at the end of the webcast today, so please stick around for that. And in addition, on that webcast or on that blog posting, I've included a link to the part two resources as well as a link to the registration page for part two. So if you want to sign up for that now, that's a good time to do that, and we hope to see you back at our next webcast. So let's get into it and talk about SharePoint Server 2007. So what are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to talk about and hopefully give you a detailed understanding of the architecture of SharePoint Server 2007. So we're going to talk about a number of concepts around the technologies, the server roles, network conditions and network dependencies. We're going to give you an overview of some of the administration features of SharePoint. So we'll talk about the three-tiered administration, the central administration, shared services, and site settings. And we'll talk about each one of those components and some common usage scenarios for those. And we'll also talk then about some deployment options that you have, and we'll give you some things to consider when you're thinking about what sort of topology you'll want to support and configure. So we'll use some scenarios, and we'll examine four different topologies, and we'll talk about those in detail, what they mean, what the implications are there. Of course, the simplest of those topologies is a single server deployment, and that's actually the deployment that I'm going to be demonstrating today and actually rolling out. In fact, in this session, I will actually build a Microsoft Office SharePoint Server 2007 right from the ground up. So some of the demonstration is going to involve launching some pretty lengthy processes, and I'll try to launch those prior to going back into slides. At one point, I will actually bring up a new server that's already configured. So I will do a little bit of a Julia Childs kind of a demo where we put the cake in the oven, go to commercial, and then at the end of the commercial, the cake is magically baked. So do stick around for those. I'm really excited to be able to give those to you today. Now, I always like to also mention some helpful experience. And what I mean by that is some things that hopefully you'll have some experience with so that you can get the most out of the webcast today. So hopefully you'll have some experience with SharePoint services and Windows Server 2003. Really just a basic understanding of those technologies will help you get the most out of the webcast. This is a level 200 session today. So first off on our agenda here, we're going to talk about some of the feature areas of SharePoint Server 2007. And this is really as a result of some customer requests, and really then resulting in the design goals around SharePoint, resulting in then the feature areas that we're going to talk about today. Now, at the center of all the feature areas are what we call platform services. Now, by platform services, I mean here we're talking about the workspaces, the management capabilities, security support, storage, the topology, and the site model. And next on our wheel of features here is the business intelligence area. Now, a big goal of SharePoint Server 2007 is to help you and your organizations provide business intelligence capabilities to all your employees. So business intelligence for the masses. Ideally, everyone should be able to share, control, and reuse business information in order to make better and more timely decisions. It's all about decision support. So the more readily available we can make that information, the better it is for our business, and the better and more competitive we can be. Next on our wheel of features is collaboration. Now, if we give people easy access to documents, to information, and even to other people, that's a great thing. People who are more connected are also more productive. So Windows SharePoint Services is going to help teams stay connected and productive through easy access to documents, to information, and even to other people. The portal component of Office SharePoint Server 2007 includes features that are especially useful for designing, for deploying, for managing things, such as enterprise intranet portals, corporate internet presence websites, or maybe even just divisional portal sites. The portal component makes it easy to connect people within the organization to other people who have the right skills, the right knowledge, or project experience that you're looking for. The search component of Office SharePoint Server 2007. Search has been significantly enhanced in this release. We have new features here that provide a consistent and familiar search experience. We've increased the relevance of search and the search results, and a new search engine that does improve on relevance and the results that are returned. New functions to search for not only documents and files, but also for people and for expertise, as I talked about earlier. The ability to index and search data in line, not only files and people, but also your line of business applications. So applications that have some third-party database. You can actually connect into that database and also in turn add that into your indexed information so that you can return search results based on that. Greatly improved manageability and extensibility of the whole search platform. Content management has been greatly enhanced. We've added some wonderful content management features in SharePoint Server 2007 around areas around document management, records management, and web content management. And then finally, the last section here is business forms. Microsoft Office Form Server 2007 helps your organization streamline forms-driven business processes. So these are processes that involve information collection. And so what we're doing here is we're making it really easy to do, easy to build intelligent XML-based electronic forms that will integrate smoothly with your existing systems. So it's security enhanced, it's a client-server platform, it gives rapid solution for the sake of creation and deployment of these forms. So it centralizes forms management as well as maintenance, and it helps extend these business processes to all of your employees and indeed even to your customers, your partners, and your suppliers. So having given you the brief outline of what you get with SharePoint Server 2007 and Microsoft Office SharePoint Server, let's actually start building our own server here. So the first thing we're going to do is configure a server as a web server, kind of lay the foundation for doing this. Now this is what Janet was talking about when we're launching some application sharing here. So now's a good opportunity to hit F5 on your keyboard, bring you full screen, and hopefully you can see my 1024 by 768 workspace here. And right now I'm working on a server, and this server has Windows Server 2003 Enterprise Edition installed. And I've done some initial configuration here. Now one of the first things you need to do on this Windows Server 2003, and this has to be Service Pack 1, or you could be running Windows Server 2003 R2, what I need to do is configure this as an application server. What we're doing here is, in a sense, installing IIS. Now you can see when I open up Manage Your Server, and in fact I'll show you where that's found. It's found under Administrative Tools. There's the Manage Your Server wizard. You can use this, or you can use the Configure Your Server wizard as well to do this. But I've added the application server role, which in turn installs IIS. It installs Internet Information Server. And during that installation, I also installed the ASP.NET components. So a way to do that would be then to add or remove a server role, click Next, allow it to scan for the current roles that are installed. And then if the application role hadn't been installed previously, all you would have to do is select Application Server. It would probably say no initially, and click Next and walk through. And as long as you have your Windows CD, you're able to then install this additional role. And also, as I said, make sure that you enable ASP.NET during that installation. So we've already done that on this server. Save us a little time in our demonstration. And we've configured this as an application server. Now another thing we need to do is there's a requirement for ASP.NET to be installed on this server. Now ASP.NET 2.0 was installed when I installed SQL Server. Now, SQL Server is not strictly required for you to install. However, I'm going to be building a server farm, and I want to have a little bit more flexibility, maybe at later points when I want to distribute the load a little bit. We'll talk about different scenarios a little bit later in the session today. But I just want to show you what I have installed on this server. when I installed SQL Server 2005, well, again, I want to also point out, because it's not strictly required, we'll actually install the SQL engine, SQL Server Express engine on the background, so it's not required that you have SQL 2005 installed. But I have done that, which in turn installed the .NET Framework 2.0 for me. Now, I've also installed the .NET Framework 3.0, and then a little bit later I'll talk to you about why I installed that. Now, with the Framework 2.0 installed, we also have to make sure that the 2.0 version is the version that's being used, because remember, these different versions of the .NET Framework can actually exist side by side on the server. So I'm going to go to a command prompt, and I'm going to navigate to the Windows folder in the Microsoft.NET Framework, and then the v2.0.50727 folder. And I'm going to run a command that's going to tell me which version is currently being used for IIS. And the command I'm going to run is ASP.NET regiis, and I'm going to use it with the -lv command. And this is going to report back to me that it looks like the .NET Framework version 1.1 is currently the root of my IIS configuration. So the IIS is, in a sense, using 1.1 version of the .NET Framework. Well, that's not what I want to have happen. So instead, I'm going to use the -I command in order to update this and essentially point the root to this .NET Framework 2.0 version. Now, this will take just a second to run. And once that's done, I'll be able to use the .lv version again, option one more time to verify that the .NET Framework 2.0 is being used by IIS. So let this complete. It's always fun to watch. There we go, dots going across the screen. And let's run that -lv command one more time, and there we see now that it's pointing to .NET Framework 2.0. So great. Now, one last thing that you may want to be aware of, and that is that you have to make sure that you're running IIS in a certain way. You're not actually supporting older applications that require IIS version 5. We're running IIS version 6 here. And so what I want to do is on the websites folder in the Internet Information Services Manager, I'm going to look at the properties here. And the reason I'm doing this is I want to make sure on the Services tab that we are not running in isolation mode, IIS 5 isolation mode. It's required that you do not run in isolation mode, that you indeed take full advantage of IIS 6 for this application. Okay, so that's some initial considerations and some installation of the application server support. Let's go on to the slides and talk a little bit more before we go back in and actually start our installation. So we've examined some of the design goals of SharePoint. We talked about some of the features. Let's talk about some administration concepts now. SharePoint administration is web-based. It gives you full control over delegation and secure isolation. Now, there's 3 tiers to the administration in this web administration: the site settings, shared services, and the central administration. The first tier, central administration, this is the fact that there is one central administration site, and this is important, for the entire farm. So your entire Microsoft Office SharePoint server farm is going to have one central administration site. So the benefit, of course, is that it is central and that it reduces administrator time, makes things more efficient for an administrator to be able to quickly identify what has to be done among and throughout the entire farm. And indeed, notice at the bottom of the slide, you actually have a reference to the farm topology here. I'll show that in the demonstration coming up. Central administration gives easy access to administrative tasks. So we have a list here that's informing operators what has to be done, explaining the actions needed, giving links to the user interface that's necessary to perform these steps. The topology portion, as I mentioned, giving you a quick view of the farm servers and their status and the services that are currently running on those servers. So we can easily link to those services and launch the administration for those. And then also giving links to additional operations and application management pages on the left-hand side. So it links you to those portions of the server that help you manage your server or server farm, changing the farm topology, specifying which services are running on each server, changing settings that affect multiple servers or applications. So this page is really where everything starts. The second administrative tier is shared services. Shared services are a really good definition of a shared service is a high-value, resource-intensive service that can be grouped together. So each server farm can have from one to many shared services, as well as sharing then those services among several farms. So Office SharePoint server infrastructure relies on shared services, and this is where we're doing site and cross-site level Office server features. So it makes it possible then to separate services from the portals. So we're removing a scale limitation that we've had in the past for the number of portals that are allowed. Also, shared services allow for services to act together as a group. The shared service provider, or the SSP as it's sometimes called, is what provides the infrastructure for shared services. Now there's three components to this infrastructure. We have the SSP administrative site, the databases, and the shared web service hosting. Shared services include Office server search, directory import, user profile synchronization, audiences, targeting, business data catalog, Excel calculation service, and usage reporting. Now there is a shared service provider default, which is the first one that you build, and it's automatically set as the default SSP. And as an administrator, you can change that default to another SSP if you want. However, whatever SSP you have set as the default cannot be deleted at that point. But the notion of the default means that all new or existing web applications are automatically associated with the default SSP, whichever one you've set as the default. Content web applications are almost always associated with one SSP. The security implications of that mean that the content application pool is granted rights across the SSP. Now there's some great benefits to shared services. We've hinted at some of those already, but the first thing is that we're optimizing resources. We're allowing servers within the farm to have access all to the same necessary services. And the second benefit is that we have some security isolation. Our services are isolated from the portal. So along with the flexibility that gives us, it allows us then to be able to delegate administration. So we can have power users that can administer a shared service instance without having to necessarily have full central administration rights. And finally, the shared services, as I hinted earlier, can be used across farms. So not only one shared server, a shared service provider for a farm, but even when you're deploying multiple farms, they can all share the same shared service provider. So now you have the ability to also actually create more than one shared service provider as well. So you can use shared services administration and build an additional shared service provider. However, the vast majority of installs are only going to need to use one SSP. Now there's a couple of situations where you might want to use multiple SSPs. Times where you need to secure some isolation of services and the service data. Maybe you need to do that because you're working in hosted environments, you're restricting access to certain sites, or maybe you have organizational or political concerns. The third administrative tier is site settings. So on the new site settings page, the business site owner can perform site-specific configuration and tasks. So he or she can customize current lists or create new lists. There's also a link to a site usage report to user alerts and other site administration tasks. So from this page, you administrators can specify users and permissions for the site. Administrators can also perform site collection administration, which includes search settings, site hierarchy, and site collection audit settings, among other settings. Now it's on the site settings area where we have the ability to delegate management of common tasks to other users. We also have and take advantage of the security trimmed user interface. And what I mean by a security trimmed user interface is that if a user only has rights to do certain things, then only those links will be shown to that user. They will not see things that they will not then be able to do. So it trims the user interface before it ever displays it to the user based on that user's rights. That's important in many areas of Office SharePoint Server. So let's actually go back to our installation of SharePoint. At this point, we're going to install or talk about some of the prerequisites for installing Office SharePoint Server, and then I'm going to actually launch our SharePoint Server installation. So once again, we're going to go back into the application sharing here. One second. And back on our server here. Now notice I've also installed the .NET Framework version 3. Now the reason I did that is because Windows SharePoint Server requires the Windows Workflow Foundation. And Windows Workflow Foundation is found in and included in the .NET Framework version 3. So install the .NET Framework version 3, you will get then the Windows Workflow Foundation runtime as part of that. In previous beta builds, it was actually we were actually distributing the Workflow Foundation as a separate installation. Now the installation is as a part of the .NET Framework 3.0. So that installed as our last prerequisite, and actually you will be notified of those prerequisites should you attempt to do an install prior to having those pieces in place. But I have a CD available to me that contains the Microsoft Office SharePoint Server, so I'm just going to go ahead and launch that installation. And the first thing it's going to ask me for is a product key. Now before you all get excited and start writing this down as I'm typing this in, I am going to hide this. So bear with me 1 second. I'm going to jump back to the slides while I go into my server. You all thought you were going to get a free product key, didn't you? Let me type that in for us here. And I won't say it as I'm typing it either. A little quiet time there. Hate dead air. And I click Continue. And now I can actually go back into the sharing again. There we go. Now we are at the accepting the terms of the agreement. So I'll go ahead and say yes and continue. And now we want to choose the type of installation. Now, I already mentioned I'm interested in building an installation that is flexible in terms of being able to scale at some later point. So I want to make sure that I choose the advanced setup. If you choose the basic install, basically you're saying this is a single server standalone using default settings. It's not going to be scalable. So I'm going to choose the advanced settings. And at this point we can do a number of configurations. I'm going to install all components in this case. And this means really, and as it says here, we can add servers then to form a SharePoint farm. If I chose the standalone installation, well then essentially I'm installing the SQL Server as well, and we cannot add this into a farm or create a farm from this starting point. We could also create a web front end from this point, simply another web presence in our existing farm. Choosing file locations and so on can be done here as well. I'm going to use the defaults for my installation. And also whether or not you want to contribute to the Customer Experience Improvement Program. I'm going to choose to do that later. Although I do highly recommend that you all join up. All right, so let's go ahead and do our complete installation. And the installation process is going to take a little bit. So rather than sitting here and watching the blue bar go across, which I'm sure we all spend so much time doing, you're as excited about that as I am. Let's go ahead back to our slides. And in this case, let's talk now about a couple of different scenarios, some different considerations, and some architecture that you really should consider. So that's the next on our agenda here, talking about architecture and configuration. Now the physical architecture of SharePoint is divided into 3 areas. We have the topology, we have the server roles, the roles a servers can play, and we have the network capabilities. Now topology is what we're talking about when we're deciding on how to group the services on our hardware as needed. So here we're scaling our hardware, we're deploying our services based on our own needs. And we're trying to make it easy for us to be able to change the number of servers per role and have servers, some may be 32-bit servers, some can be 64-bit, maybe we have a mixture of the two. It really doesn't have any bearing on this. This is the whole notion of topology. Now when we're talking about server roles, this is what we're talking about when we're considering the necessary components of SharePoint. So roles such as a front-end web server, an application server, and a database server, those three tiers. Now in the case of our single server architecture, we have one server that's encompassing all of those server roles. Now as we build our farm structure and we expand that a little bit, then we're going to be delegating those roles to separate servers. The application server may also expand itself to include an indexing server, a search server, and an Excel calculation server, among other applications. And then finally, the network capabilities are built into SharePoint. So with SharePoint 2007, we have a single infrastructure that can support intranet sites, internet, or even extranet portals. So an extranet being the first tier feature that can span domains. Also, SharePoint provides SQL authentication support, network security features, including support for SSL or IPsec, Internet Protocol Security, among other networking features and security features. So now let's talk about a couple of different scenarios in our deployment. Of course, the one we're doing here is a single server deployment. This is really the simplest deployment scenario. So here's where we have that single server that has all of the necessary SharePoint components. We're supporting a front-end server there. We're doing the application services, so it's our application server. And it also has our databases running, so it's our database server. So this is, in this scenario, this is going to include then all of our content sites. It will also have all aspects of the shared service provider. So it's those aspects being the SSP admin site, the shared services themselves, and then the shared web services. And it will also be our central administration point, because it's our first server installed. By default, it's our one central administration server. And also including then all of our databases. As I mentioned, in our scenario that we're building here, I installed SQL Server 2005. You could be employing or deploying the basic installation, which then includes the installation of SQL Express, as I mentioned earlier. So the benefit, of course, of the single server is that it's the fastest, easiest deployment. The drawback, though, is going to be that we have limited data and user load capability. So it's not as flexible and not as full function, or not. I'm sorry, that shouldn't say full function. It's not as scalable. Also provides actually the reduction of availability. The possibility of a problem going on one server, of course, is causing us more problems. A single point of failure. Now I'm going to return to the demonstration just quick here to bear with me one second. Let me see how my installation is going. Looks like our bar is about 90% across. So I'll go ahead and go to the next slide here and talk about our next scenario. And that is where we're talking about building a small server farm. So here we're involving more than just a single server. We're distributing the server roles across and among more than one server. Now in this scenario we have we'll consider having two load balanced servers which function as our front-end web servers, and application servers. And then we'll also have a dedicated SQL server on the back end. So this scenario, the first server will contain central administration, as I said. In any farm, there's only one central administration server, and then servers 1 and 2 will also contain then the content sites and the shared service providers, or the single shared service provider. And then our third server is our dedicated SQL server. This is going to contain all of the databases. So with a small farm, again, the advantage of greater data and user load capability, and it's much more so over a single server scenario. So we're also increasing availability and reliability. The limitations, though, include long-running operations and other network considerations. So there's still some drawbacks here that we could maybe address by expanding our farm even further. Now at this point, let's go ahead back to our slides here. I'm going to our finishing steps of our SharePoint installation. It's like our server is done installing. And in fact, even though I selected Run the SharePoint Products and Technologies Configuration Wizard now, there was something about this installation that requires me to do a system reboot. So let me go ahead and launch the reboot here. And while that's happening, we'll go into our slides one more time and talk about our next scenario. Of course, we're going up the ladder here, so now we're talking about a medium server farm. So we've added another server in this case. We still have load-balanced front-end web servers, but instead of a single SQL server, we may consider clustered SQL servers on the back end. And we've also included a separate application server, and this one being an indexing application server. So the load balanced web servers contain the content sites and the SSP admin site, the shared services, and the shared web services. Our application server contains some aspects of the shared service providers, so it includes some shared web services, and it also does the indexing of the shared services. It also contains our central administration. And finally, our clustered SQL server contains all the databases. So medium farm has similar advantages to the small farm. We have greater data and user load capability, better availability and reliability, and we have the ability to exercise feature deployment, and the added strength is in better performance. Now, the limitation in this case is going to involve, well, certainly because we're more involved, more servers to configure, there's a greater amount of setup and configuration. And again, we may have some other network restrictions that we might want to overcome. Let me check my installation here, my booting here. Looks like it's still booting up my server. I'll go ahead and let the server start up here. And we'll talk about one more version. The last option that we have here, of course, is the large server farm. So here we're actually splitting every server role to a separate server. We may even be sharing some roles between servers. So our front-end servers, again, contain all the content sites on the SSP administration site. Our clustered SQL servers contain all the databases, and the difference in this scenario is that our application servers are used each for separate application tasks. So we're splitting up indexing, search, Excel calculation. You may have one or more application server for additional applications as you add them. And again, our first application server being the one that contains our central administration site. So the benefit here is that we have the greatest performance capabilities. And it gives us the advantages of the medium server farm with similar limitations. But we have the greater setup time, greater configuration. But the benefit here, of course, is the performance for a real large-scale deployment. Now, like this and all other scenarios, you really need to understand your organization's current needs, the capabilities of your servers and your network in order to determine then which scenario will really work best in your environment. So let's go back to our installation here one more time here. And the last thing we're going to do is finish up our installation. So I'm going to log in here. And the first thing I'm going to want to run is the SharePoint Products and Technologies Configuration Wizard. And that was the one that it wanted to, or allowed me to, launch even from the end of the setup. But because we had to restart, we'll actually launch that from here. Now notice I have some new programs installed. Well, that's good. Let's go ahead and open that up. Microsoft Office Server, and there's our central administration. But here is the wizard that we really want to run. So we have to launch that first in order to configure our initial, or to do some initial configuration of this installation. It'll take just a second for that to come up. Welcome to the Products and Technologies. And notice it's going to have to stop and start some services for me, so I'm going to say yes. Go ahead and do that. Now, if we were adding this server to a server farm that was already created, we could connect this server to that farm at this point. Now, in this case, we're creating a brand new server farm. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that option. And we have to specify where the database server is. Well, it happens to be the local machine, so I'll enter that name here. And the database name, we can go ahead and leave the default for that. It's usually a good idea to leave the default names when it comes to database naming. And then we also need to specify the database access account. So you'll need to have some account set aside for the sake of that access. Now, for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and use my administrator account. You would probably have a separate account for that. Click Next. And then we can specify a port number for our central administration web application. Notice that it dynamically and randomly generates one for me, so I can go ahead and use that for the administration page. If you were picky, you could use your own port. Now, it's important that you don't use one of the more common or well-known ports, any port from 0 to 1023. Really not a good idea to use that. but you can specify your own port number if you choose. And then also you have some security settings and security choices. I'm going to go ahead and use NTLM, but you do have Kerberos authentication available to you as well. So there's a summary of our settings, and I'll click Next. And now it's going to run through the initial creation of our administration web application. So this step actually takes a little while to run. Notice it's already in task 2 of 9, but this is going to take a little bit longer than what we want to wait around for in this webcast. So what I'm going to do is close this out. I'm going to go back to the slides for just a second here, and then actually deploy the rest of the services. Actually, I'll do that right now. Let me go ahead back to my slide here for 1 second and change this out. Make sure I have that the proper server running. And this is the next step that we're going to do. We're going to enable now. We're going to take our server that's been configured. It's been installed. We've installed the administration web application, and now we're going to actually take a look at the services on the server, enable those, create our SSP, our shared service provider, and then configure some additional indexing settings. Now this will be the remainder of our session today. And as I mentioned, some of these steps are going to require us watching as a web application or a website attempts to be built. So it might take a little bit of time to do that. And I'll try to jump into the question and answer queue during some of those pauses here. So you can go ahead and make sure if you do have any questions, feel free to enter those now. Let's go back into our sharing. And here is our, as I said, the Julia Childs demo. This is the cake that we pulled out of the oven after the commercial break. And notice I've even put a shortcut to the SharePoint Central Administration on the desktop. That wouldn't be there by default. You can, as I showed earlier, we have it under All Programs and then under Microsoft Office Server, the Central Administration page. So we'll go ahead and launch that. And enter our credentials. And here's our initial web application. Notice we have a number of administrator tasks that are being listed here for us, so we can see what is expected of us. Notice I have a big red note in the upper left-hand corner that our server farm configuration is not yet complete. Here's that area that I mentioned earlier, the fact that we have this farm topology now being able to be centrally administered in SharePoint Server 2007, and actually seeing the services that are currently running and available on any particular server. Now, as I mentioned, this is a one server farm here. Go ahead and click on that SharePoint server in order to then manage the services that are required. Now another step that I did ahead of time here, and this is something that I did after launching the central administration for the first time, and that is to step through and look at the services that are currently run. And a couple of these are actually required for our farm. Now one thing I did was I made sure that I select the server role. So for the sake of the list of services that are displayed here, we have a single server or single web server for a small server farm. So all services are running on this server. And then I also enabled and started the services such as the Excel calculation service. And it was really as simple as clicking Start, and it essentially launched that service. Now, it's a little more complex when we talk about things such as the Office SharePoint Server Search service. In that case, I clicked Start, and it brought me to a web page which asked me whether or not I wanted to use this server for indexing content or serving the search queries. And in this case, I do want to use those for both. I entered an email address for the sake of it, anyone that needed to contact an administrator if they had an issue or a problem using search on this server. I entered a farm search service account, and again, you would probably use some other account for that. For the sake of this demonstration, I'll just use the administrator, and I entered the password as well. And then the final thing I did here was to verify what kind of crawling. Now, what these choices are here. If I click Use all front-end web or end computers for crawling, essentially what I'm saying here is I'm configuring the search service on the server that provides services and renders content. Now, if we're configuring a search service on a server that's a standalone search server, and if it doesn't provide the web services or the web rendering content, then we would want to click Use a dedicated front-end server for the sake of the crawling. That's not our case, so I left that as the default. And then the last one I had to enable also was the Windows SharePoint Services search. So the Services Help search. So this really has to do with indexing the help content on the sites. And this is the piece that's built into Windows SharePoint Services. Office SharePoint Server Search, of course, is the part that comes in addition with Office SharePoint Server. But for that one as well, we had some initial configuration, both of a service account. We can configure a content access account. And in fact, I actually left that one blank. We'll specify that later. And then how often I want that content searched and actually sending, or indexed, I should say. And so I set up a schedule of daily for the sake of the indexing. So once we were done with that configuration, now we need to actually go in and create the shared service provider. I mentioned we need to have a shared service provider in order to then host essentially those services. So to do that, I'm going to go into Application Management. And the first thing up at the top of Office SharePoint Servers Shared Services is to create or configure this farm's shared services. So that's what I'm going to do here. And I'm going to create a new shared service provider. And we're going to fill in some information. Now notice one thing we need to do, first of all, we have to give it a unique name, and it's already filled in one and added a number 1 at the end of it, so that it essentially is going to attempt to create its own unique name for the SSP. And we also have to associate a new web application for the sake of administering this shared service provider. So to do that, we currently don't have any web applications built to support that, so I'm going to create a new web application. And this step might actually take a little time here. Now this is an administration page. This is not necessarily what I want to come up as the default port 80. So I'm actually going to change this port to some other number, a little higher and less known, maybe 8088 just as a little memorial to the first PC clone that I purchased. And for the sake of this shared service provider application, this web application will define the security configuration, whether or not we'll allow anonymous access. In this case, I don't want to do that. If we choose to use SSL, then we have to make sure we have a certificate installed and would do that within the IIS administration tools. What the URL is going to look like in a load balance scenario. In this case, we're balancing a load of one server. And then we need to set up some authentication for the sake of the application pool. Now we can use the predefined pool, or we can use and configure some other account for the sake of that authentication. I'll go ahead and use the network service for the sake of this administration page. We may want to restart IIS, and we can do it manually or automatically. I'll go ahead and have this application restart IIS automatically for the sake of it to be able to come up. And then any authentication for the sake of the database. Now we're using Windows Authentication here, so that's okay for this. And the search server has already been determined for us. Now if we had more than one search server available, it would ask us then to choose which server to use for the sake of Office SharePoint Server Search. So now we're going to create the web application. And this is the point I was talking about earlier that's going to require a little bit of patience on your part. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to jump out quick here to the question and answer queue and see if we have any questions that I can address here. Well, someone calling themselves Bill Gates, so if it is Mr. Gates, I appreciate you joining our webcast today. We'd like to deploy an internal SharePoint server along with external unlimited access servers accessible by our customers and partners. What are the considerations we need to take into account? And can we seamlessly publish content to the external server concurrently using ISA 2006 link translation? Great questions. Well, to address your first portion of your question, what are some of the considerations to take into account? Well, certainly security and access, and with that, certainly the ISA server is actually a very good thing to bring up. The fact that you want to do some link translation. Your external access to the same server that's serving up internal access probably has a different name that it's known by. And in fact, we're actually going to cover that in part 2 of the webcast on Wednesday, where we actually talk about how not only we actually won't use ISA server, but we can actually use SharePoint server directly. SharePoint server actually has that capability of doing this link translation, both for the sake of external URLs, that is the URLs that are used to access the site from an external source, and then the translation of the outgoing URL. And the outgoing URL means how are we building our web pages with links that refer to, again, externally known names. So it's not returning a web page with a bunch of internal name servers on it in the links provided. So those sorts of things are done by SharePoint Server for you with a little configuration. Other considerations, certainly, you certainly need to consider the licensing scenario for the sake of external access and the different licensing options involved. And I'm not going to go into any licensing at all in this webcast because I am not a licensing expert. When will MOS 2007 become available? It's available now. My understanding is that it became available, if not with, then certainly very shortly after Office released to manufacturing, which also means that, in a sense, I guess, with Office not really being released to the public until later this month, for the sake of just being able to purchase it, then certainly by the end of this month, the month of January, you should be able to acquire it. And his question along with this is, can blogs and wikis be easily tied to users' Active Directory groups? Yes, they can, it's really a matter of. Now, I assume you're talking in terms of permissions, and in that sense, yes, they can be. If you mean something else, then you need to clarify a little bit more in your question. Okay, so that's a couple of those. And one comment from one person: I don't trust you. He says, you don't trust us? Yes, I don't trust you to take a key for a product and use it. Well, no, I trust you. Of course I trust all of you. It's the people that are viewing this on demand later. Those are the people I don't trust. Was that politically correct enough for you? Okay. Now let's go back to our sharing slide and see. Yes, indeed, we've created our application. Now, one thing I'm not seeing on this page, let me just refresh this page. This happens sometimes. I'm not sure why this happened this time. My web application should actually show up here as the web application that we've built. Let's go ahead. Maybe it didn't like the port number I chose. I'm going to go ahead and create another one and just let it automatically assign a port. And maybe one other thing I can attempt to do, just make sure that this is going to work for us as well. Let's go ahead and let that build a web application for us again. So a couple of other additional questions here. Thanks, these are great questions, guys. Saul asks, is there any restrictions for handling MOS 2007 on an IIS server that has front page server extensions enabled? I don't know the answer to that question directly. I haven't run into that scenario. I haven't tried that out to see if there are any restrictions or implications if front page server extensions were indeed installed as well. So I really don't know. I would like to say that there wouldn't be any implications or restrictions there, but I really can't say that with 100% certainty. So I don't want to mislead you there. Please, and when you ask these questions, I appreciate that you do that. I'm going to make sure that these questions are also then entered into my question and answer queue, and I actually do respond to these and include the best answers and best questions and answers on my blog as well. So I'm going to make sure I collect these and add these as a blog entry later. So I'm going to find out a little bit further. For any of the questions that I'm not able to address directly, I'm certainly going to do some research for you and find out the definitive answer on those. SharePoint URLs are notoriously long and cumbersome. What is the recommendation for aliasing sites? Is there a better way to do it through SharePoint, or does each site have to have its own IP and then use DNS for the aliasing? SharePoint sites don't need to have their own IP address, so you don't really need to use DNS for the aliasing. What you can actually do is essentially they're all what are called virtual servers in the, and I'm not talking about virtual server as in the product Microsoft Virtual Server. Here we're talking about in the context of IIS, they are virtual servers. So they are essentially represented by something unique about them. It could be the name, and in that case, yes, you would end up with very long URLs, or it could be simply the port number, and the port number then defining essentially which content this site should be pulling from. So you do have a couple of options there that could help you in that whole problem of having extremely long URLs. It's not going to solve it completely. You're still going to have some URLs that do tend to be generated a little bit longer. Can you use Virtual Server 2005 and Virtual PC 2007 in conjunction for creating scenario 2 and 3 for testing? Absolutely. You can use, you would use one or the other because the networking, well, actually, you could use both because either one, hosted on a different machine or even the same machine, does have the ability to share networking and in that sense, share connectivity. So yeah, it's a really good scenario for doing this testing of these scenarios. A really good option. All right, let's go back to our, double check how my application's doing. It looks like it's up and running, so let's go back to that page here. Now notice it's come back to the new shared service provider and now linked to this web application, which is what I had intended the first time through. It's going to also ask me for a My Site location. Now it's recommended that your My Site location be different than the web application. I'm going to leave it the same, and it's going to give me a warning after I configure this. We would probably also want to create a new web application for the My Site location. The SSP service credentials, we're going to make sure we enter some here. Database server, go ahead and leave that as Windows Authentication. Search database, and again, just leaving the default name is fine. The index server to choose, and because we only have the one, it's only giving me the option of selecting that one. And then whether or not we're using SSL, and in the current case, we're not using it. And here's that warning I mentioned about having the My Sites and the SSP administration site at the same web application. But we'll go ahead and say OK. This is OK for our scenario here. So now we're actually doing the final build-up of our SSP. So we've got the web application associated with the SSP administration, and now our shared service provider is being built. And again, this is one of those that are going to take a little while, so let me go back to our questions and see how we're doing there. But let me see actually if I can do that while you might see a little bit of a black screen here, but I'm going to get the question manager out of the way and you can actually watch the progress here. Okay, so a little bit of a black rectangle, I'm sure, on the lower right-hand corner of your screen, but that's okay. That's because I'm opening up the question manager while we're doing this here. Okay, so Chris asks, can you combine a search server role with Excel services? Yeah, you can. Basically, that shared service provider can handle all of those services for you initially. And for those of you that are not familiar with it, Excel services provide the ability to render an Excel spreadsheet in a web application. So in a website or in a shared service, SharePoint site that you build, you can actually host an Excel spreadsheet and actually have it be interactive in a read-only fashion. So you can actually take and do pivot table analysis on a spreadsheet right there within your web application. Benefit is you don't need to have Excel. Maybe you have a workstation that's remotely configured or remotely connecting. You simply need to access that. And again, here now we're talking about business intelligence and the power of bringing the business information to the users. I noticed, Phil's asking, I noticed clustered SQL servers in the diagrams. Is database mirroring supported, and is auto failover function supported? Yeah, it absolutely is supported. Database mirroring and auto failover. It's an application against a database like any other application would be. So the same sorts of, well, I don't want to say gotchas, but the same sort of issues apply. So any kind of a failover solution, of course, quicker is better. Database mirroring, of course, being a very fast solution for the sake of when an application, when a database fails and has this live mirror location available to it, and you have the quorum of 3 services, and they say, okay, well, the first mirror copy failed, the initial one failed, so we can go to the failover mirror, and it actually happens fairly quickly. And because this is all built and supported in .NET, then it does have the built-in support for this failover to happen automatically for you. Thank you. Great question, Phil. What did you do about the updates? Oh, what did you do about all the updates the Windows Server 2003 R2 needs to install when it's freshly deployed? Did you install them all? Yeah. When I built this server, we don't have R2 installed on this server. At least I don't think so. I have to double check that. I think it's just Windows Server 2003 SP1. But what do you do about those? The question is, what do you do about the updates? Do you install them all? Certainly, it's highly recommended that you do that. You allow the Microsoft update or whatever your update scenario is, whether or not you're using Windows Update Services, or if you're using Windows Server Update Services, or you're using Microsoft Update. Either way, you really should update your server to be up to date. And another part of the question is the .NET 3.0 downloadable? Is it a downloadable package? Absolutely it is. You can install it separately. And that's really my recommendation. Update your machine as much as possible, understand the prerequisites, get them configured prior to the launching of your installation. And of course, it will tell you during the installation what's missing should you attempt to do that. Let's see. Kevin, could you please tell us what are the recommended audiences for each deployment topology? Small, medium, large farm. What's the maximum number of users is what he's asking. You know, I can't really give you a number. It's one of those it depends answers because it really does depend on your network topology. It depends on the capabilities of the servers that you're using. It depends on what your choice is for a database solution. So I would love to be able to give you some recommendations just off the top of my head. I know that there are some good documentation of the SharePoint server site and the Microsoft Office site that can lead you to some good recommendations for number of users and the type of hardware that you should really consider. Don't have that information for you right here. So again, it's one of those it depends answers. Brad asks, do you have to complete all the tasks in the central administration front page before adding content sites? No, actually you don't. You can actually start adding content sites, and there's pieces that you can do at that point. In fact, you know what, Brad? That actually leads me to consider maybe doing that. This creation of the SSP is taking a bit longer than I expected it would. So let me go back to our server here, and I'm going to go ahead and open up another instance of our administration page. And as our SSP is being built, let's go ahead and build our first web app, our main website. So to do that, I'm going to go to Application Management, and we're going to create or extend a web application. So what we're going to do is create a new web application. And I'm going to make sure that this web application is the one that we want at port 80, because this is going to be our default home page. We set up our security configuration and so on, our URL application pool. How we want to handle IIS services, I'll go ahead and have it restart automatically. We could do it manually though, and actually in a later step you'll see it gives us the actual command line that we could use to restart IIS if that was required at that point. And search server is already provided for us, so let's go ahead and say OK. Now once again we have a couple of different services currently chugging away against our little virtual hard disk here. I'm going to go ahead and cancel the SSP operation here, because that really was the whole end point of that was going to be that it was created successfully, and now we had that location that was going to handle those shared services for us. So now we're watching our installation of our first website. And in fact, even while that's taking place, I'll go ahead and launch yet another instance of our administration page. If it's not too busy. Because I want to show you a couple of other steps and things to consider. Just some nice administrative notes here. Notice that on our home page of Central Administration, we have some administrator tasks listed here. If I click on Administrator Tasks here, we get the full list of things that we should consider. Certainly one of the first ones being read the Quick Start Guide. It's a really good documentation for how to, things to consider when you're rolling out the services, configuring the services, creating the SSP, and so on. Number of services here that you can read, configuring incoming email settings, outgoing settings, workflow settings, info path form services, if we need to support that here. Even on down to diagnostic logging. Maybe we want to do a quick configuration of how the logging of our different diagnostics are happening. In this case, we can choose again to sign up for the Customer Experience Program, and again, I recommend you do that. Setting up different options for error reporting, maybe even collecting information from Microsoft that can help us identify system problems. Selecting then how we want to throttle the logging. I can allow it to view and choose to report on all information, maybe on just specific different components, maybe on just database usage, for example. And different levels of events, from least critical event that's going to the event log or to the trace log. We'll go ahead and use the defaults here and say OK, just to show you that once I do that, it actually removes it now from our list of administrator tasks. So once we go through those, our list gets smaller, and that's a good thing. Notice we even have support for configuring antivirus settings. If we have an antivirus product that supports Windows SharePoint services, we can configure how our antivirus settings on the site is going to use it and when documents are going to be scanned, either on upload or on download, and so on. Now it looks like our application was created successfully, and so now I can go to the site collection page, and I need to create a site collection for this site. So let's go ahead and do that. And this is where we actually now give our site a title and some information, something useful to our users. So let's call this one our Litware Inc. homepage. And website address, we'll go ahead and use the root of that web application. We have a number of templates that we can choose from for our initial site. Notice I can choose, we have a wiki site, a blog site available to us. I'm going to go ahead and create this as a team site. Notice we even have different categories of templates. So meeting sites, enterprise sites, publishing sites. The primary site collection administrator, we can choose a user, or we can, I think we even have a browse capability, so we can even browse against the database or against the directory. And then whether or not we set a quota on our site of how much space or how much resources we're going to be using. Now I'm going to say no quota, but it's a good way to kind of rein in what you want to limit users to and limit the application in terms of how much it uses on the server. So we'll say OK. Again, this creation will just take a couple minutes here. So let me see if we have any additional questions. Are there any online learning or virtual labs for MOS, for Microsoft Office SharePoint Server, or WSS 3.0? I do believe there are. In fact, I seem to recall one I just saw recently, a free e-learning course that you can actually walk through, and it'll step you through. Some of it's multimedia, some of it's some reading, but it steps you through the different options that you have. So yes, definitely, I've seen that online. And in fact, when I have this question here, I'll make sure that in my blog I point to where that resource is. Here's a good one. I just want to answer this one more question. I see that our top-level site was created successfully. In fact, let me go ahead and, while we're waiting here, I'll launch the website itself. And while that site's coming up, let me answer this one more question here. Are the Exchange public folders going away and being replaced by Microsoft Office SharePoint Server? Well, no, they're not going away. And there were some rumors that had started for a while about Exchange Server doing away with public folders, and as it turns out now, public folders will be supported for indefinitely. Initially we thought, well, they'll be supported in Exchange 2007, and then maybe in the next version of Exchange they won't be supported. However, they are still very important to many, many people, so they are not going to be going away anytime soon. So it doesn't mean that we're replacing them and absolutely forcing you to go to SharePoint. However, I do highly recommend just the flexibility of being able to support the content in this way. And with the content versioning capabilities now alone, I mean, that alone is a reason enough to move your content management from public folders into a SharePoint site. So here's our Litware Inc. home page that we've created. So this is what your users are going to go to initially. And again, the extensibility of being able to manage support of a recycle bin and site actions that show up if you have the right authentication to do that. Being able to build additional tabs here, including the support for really rich search capabilities. So this is our initial SharePoint site that we would now then customize to our own liking. All right, let me go back to the slides here one more time here, and we'll just quickly summarize what we talked about today in the session, and then maybe at the end here we'll see if we can address a couple more questions. Appreciate you guys sending those in. So what we talked about today, we talked about the design goals of Office SharePoint Server. We talked about how these are geared then toward meeting your needs and your expectations. We talked about how we've simplified the administrative structure. We talked about the 3 tiers of the administrative architecture: the central administration, the shared services, and site settings. So central administration being the single reference point for all administration components and all administrative components. The shared services, which is where we can separate services from portals and allow you a wide range of scalability options. And then the site settings, which allow you administrators to change the site-related settings, including permissions. And then finally, we talked about the deployment options that you have for deploying Office SharePoint Server, how you will want to do some planning and plan based on your organization's needs. So examine the different server roles, decide the topology that you want for your organization based on its needs. Now, for some additional information, I put together a resource page here for you, and here's where I've also included that link to my blog directly to that location where I put a more rich resource page. But certainly I also always like to point out Microsoft TechNet as the first and best first location to go to as an IT professional for IT Pro-related resources. This session's resource page is also officially at this link here, microsoft.com/technet, then DSK-101. I also like to plug the fact that I am a member of the Microsoft Across America team, and as such, we do live events. We actually do events coming to a city. And are you still there? I'm hearing a clicking noise on my end, so I'm wondering if I'm getting disconnected here.
We're here.
Okay, great. We also do live events, so go to technetevents.com and you can see when we're coming to a town near you. Right now we are in the midst of our launch activities, so we got some great big launch events that we're doing all around Windows Vista and Office 2007 and Exchange Server 2007. And we're giving away free software. So what better reason to check out when we're going to be coming to a town near you. And then also, as always, as a last resort, please feel free to email me, kevin.remdy@microsoft.com. I really appreciate you all sticking around with me a couple minutes late here today. I knew that we'd run a little bit late because of all the great demonstrations of installations that we had to give you today. But I'm going to go ahead and check out the Q&A queue one more time here and let Janet talk about a couple of other administrative items for you.
Thanks, Kevin. And I just want to remind everybody, too, if you'd like to print a PDF of these sites, you can go into your File menu in your upper navigation bar, and you'll be able to do a print a PDF so that you'll have all this contact information as well that Kevin provided here as well. So as Kevin mentioned, he's going to go take a look at the Q&A, and if there's any more additional questions you have, go ahead, submit those in there. He'll take a look at those. If he's not able to get to them, they are also posted on his blog, so you can also check back there and find any answers as well. So we do record all of these sessions, and if you'd like to see any of our previously recorded webcasts as well as everything that's coming up, everything is posted right there at microsoft.com/webcast. If you have content ideas, anything you want to see us do differently, we'd love to hear from our audience, and there is yet another URL there that's posted that you can contact us at. So today's webcast is presented using the Microsoft Office Live Meeting technology, and you can get a free 14-day trial. Just go to microsoft.com/presentlive. Now we have a survey coming up here, and I just want to let you know that for filling out this evaluation, you'll automatically get entered into a drawing to win this Zoom digital media player. So a little bit of fun there as well, but really your feedback is very valuable to us. So if you could just take a moment, fill out the survey before you log out, we do appreciate that. And you should all be seeing that survey now in your slide area. So you'll be able to hit that little registered online area, and that'll take you right into it. So with that being said, Kevin, any additional questions you want to address?
Yeah, there are a few more here. I appreciate, again, you guys asking these great questions here today. But I also want to take an opportunity to thank you very much for filling out the evaluation. We really appreciate your feedback, as Janet said. And if you registered online, you click that link and it's all filled in for you pretty much, just asking you for your opinion on the webcast. All of the registrants, then you have a little bit more information to fill out. But really appreciate you doing that. And hey, get a chance to win a Zune. How much better can you get than that? So, question, Exchange 2007 public folders. Can you offer any insight into the issues and features of this migration? Well, in terms of migration, I think if you're referring to a method of pulling information from public folders and into an Exchange or into SharePoint server, actually there isn't any way that I know directly to do that. If there are tools available that will do that, then certainly they will be built. It sounds like a really good reason to build a tool that will be able to do an export and then an import. So I imagine those will be coming. I don't know of any off the top of my head right now. I do know that the search service allows you to index and access into an Exchange server data store, essentially. So you can index on portions of your Exchange server and then return those results. And in that sense, if you still have public folders in place, the results of what's found in those public folders can actually be returned as part of a SharePoint search. Will all of the questions and answers be available after the webcast? Well, the ones that we've done here live while it's being recorded, those will be part of the webcast in audio form. If your question is in the question and answer log as I capture it here, then I will also textually address those questions, and as I mentioned, I'll make those available on my blog. And again, the blog address, I'll actually even answer that right here in the text here. So it's http://blogs.technet.com/KevinRemdy. Oops, and your question went away before I could answer it, so it didn't. It disappeared. It disappeared on me. Okay. Well, I'll make sure that gets entered into the text here in just a second. Okay, so what are your recommendations in terms of the roles which are installed on the MOS server when deploying in the context of domain networks, Active Directory? Well, I'm not sure what your question is, so I'm not really sure how to answer it. What are your recommendations in terms of which roles are installed on the MOS server? I think what you might be referring to is what happens. Am I right? Can I do this on an Active Directory server, perhaps? Am I able to install these services on a machine that's also functioning as a domain controller? And then the question is, do you add the Active Directory role? Well, yeah, that's been clarified here. Well, you can do that. I don't recommend it. The Active Directory role and domain controller really is depending on the organization, depending on how your sites are configured and how many users are at any given site. Active Directory domain controllers do get a lot of traffic and get hit pretty hard, and the ones that are functioning as global catalog servers even more so. So you need to be cautious of that. Now that said, it's not impossible. You can do it. It's just not recommended. And I believe that addresses the questions that I have here. So I want to again, thank you all very much for attending today. I sincerely hope you found something useful in the session today. I hope you'll all attend on Wednesday when we do part 2 of this 2-part series. We're going to be at the same time, same channel. We'll see you then.
Great. Well, thanks, Kevin. I'm going to remind everybody your feedback is very valuable, so if you could just take a moment, fill out that survey before you log out. We do appreciate that. With that being said, I'm just going to extend a special thanks to Kevin for today's presentation, so thanks so much, Kevin. That concludes today's TechNet Live meeting, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And as Kevin mentioned, we hope to see you all back for part 2. So now I'll disconnect from the